Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chris Castillo, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Creating a Fiber Optic Network in Your Community. Today's webinar is being brought to you by HR Green, and in the next hour or so, you'll find out about the efforts now underway in many Midwest communities to bring high-speed, affordable broadband to their citizens. Before I turn it over to our panelists and jump into the content, let me first provide you with some direction on how to use GoToWebinar. Let's look at GoToWebinar options for a moment. You can show or hide your control panel at the top toolbox with the red arrow. You can put your screen in full screen mode using the rectangle in the upper right of the toolbox. Attendees are muted during the webinar, but you can ask a question using your toolbox. To do so, click on the plus sign next to questions and type in your question and then click send. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the presentation, so feel free to send them in at any time. I just want to give you a little background about HR Green. We're a multidisciplinary professional services and construction firm offering climbing technical consulting, including broadband, engineering, environmental services, and constructions to clients in diverse markets. Founded in 1913, HR Green is one of America's oldest design and construction firms. We enjoy a long-standing reputation for environmental stewardship, public service, and technical excellence. The firm now employs over 400 people in 9 states, including multiple offices in Illinois and Iowa. Our 6 business lines provide comprehensive services in governmental services, transportation, water, energy, land development, and construction. Today's presenters are myself, Chris Castillo, and I'll be the moderator. And we also have Mr. Dave Zelnock, who's currently a local governmental services manager for HR Green. And he's been a public works director for over 20 years at various cities, and he's helped install hundreds of miles of municipal fiber infrastructure. Ed Barrett is currently our Director of Broadband Services and has over 10 years of broadband and telecommunications experience and has extensive interface with broadband and telecom carriers and municipalities. He also has managed telecom program implementation and market analysis. The agenda for today is up here. We're going to discuss the definition and define what is a smart city, and talk about how your city or village can become a smart city or become smarter, and then 5 things that you can do right now. So with no further ado, I will introduce Dave Zelnock to start on part 1. Dave?
Well, Chris, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with everybody, and I just want to walk through a little bit of our smart cities perspectives as we've seen it. The overarching question may be, why is smart so important these days? And I'd like to offer that the argument there for being smart or being smarter, there's a lot of reasons for it. Yes, aging populations, changes in urban population growth. There's a lot of economic pressure on it, both pressure on public finances, economic restructuring, as we know, but really economically, it's the right thing to do. We'll talk here in a minute about how so much retail is changing, entertainment's changing, transportation's changing, really our world is changing, and it's becoming technologically more efficient, and really it's inevitable that, that both change is happening and the technology, embracing technology is critical now in our future world. There's a lot of emerging global trends going on out there, and I wish we had more time to go through those. In fact, just a shameless plug for another presentation we often do is doing a deep dive into some of these areas. But I'll just hit on one that I was involved with. But this is a regional shopping mall. As Chris said, I'm from and working in the metropolitan Denver area. This is a fortress mall, as they're now called, that we helped demolish a few years ago in the South Denver metro area. Replaced that with what's now being called an urban center. They kept at one end the Sears and the Macy's and then scraped everything in between there, arguably for good reason. 12% of all retail by dollar volume is now online. I think about 10% of all retail by transaction numbers online, and that's growing. Again, our world is changing. Interestingly, I just saw a report yesterday talking about how that may be leveling off, that as we saw, Amazon is jacking up their prices, and with vacant retail space now plenty in the major urban areas, retail prices are dropping, and the Amazon prices are going up. So there may be a leveling off coming up there. But right now, a lot of changes going on online, and it's important for us to understand them and to, whenever we can, to embrace them. Talking about the future, the future will be definitely mobile and shared. I was just watching CBS News this morning talking about these Jetson-like flying cars out there, about how so much of our future will be both mobile in terms of our smartphones that we now have, and shared. People are now talking about transportation not as car ownership or owning a bike, but transportation as a service. Think of Uber, that's transportation as a service. In the future, many people are saying maybe by 2040, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, that most of us won't even be owning cars anymore. You won't want to, you won't need to. And that has some profound impacts. You don't need parking garages, you don't need a 3-car garage. Maybe you don't need to widen your freeways. If you're using transportation as a service, where we're becoming more efficient at using the transportation modes that we have available to us. Speaking of that, the only way really to make this happen is if you can embrace these new technologies out there. One term that I love to share with people is that's bouncing around in the lexicon these days is big data is the new bacon. In other words, the only way that all this really makes sense, it's not achievable, it's not possible to embrace these technologies without sensors, and sensors mean data. And really looking at virtually everything, you've heard of the Internet of Things or the IoT, but I like to say looking at virtually everything and looking at everything virtually now. One example that I'll throw out there is predicting traffic jams and adjusting your traffic signals dynamically and what's called parametrically. That's where you set parameters for your traffic signals. We're not talking about every Thursday afternoon as the old-fashioned way, but if a snowstorm's hitting Chicagoland, and you start to see by your utility meters show that, wow, these office buildings were dropping in power consumption. People are leaving their office buildings. They must be heading to their cars to get on the roads. Let's adjust the traffic signals as we get out there. Speaking of that, how else can you detect people and traffic out there? Believe it or not, when you leave your cell phone on, the Bluetooth device is now readable. And actually, there are tens of thousands of Bluetooth device readers looking for your inadvertently left on Bluetooth device. Likewise, your Wi-Fi will give you away. Now they talk about the private information has been stripped out of there, but still there's so much data flowing out there that right now the problem is not really adding more sensors, although in some cases that's important, but really how do you execute functions, how do you make decisions based on all this swarm of data that's going on out there, and that's actually a nice problem to have. Talking about data and sensors, dashboards are becoming increasingly important. Crowdsourcing is kind of to data what bike sharing and Uber, or the Uberization, not the urbanization, but the Uberization of the world's talking about. Crowdsourcing, one good example, if you use Waze, which is one of those transportation apps. There's a picture of my smartphone one recent day when the local interstate here was all clogged up, but Waze is simply crowdsourced. But also, as I mentioned before, Waze, which is Google, and Google Maps actually owns Waze now. The data inputs that they use for the Google Maps that we all now use, there are in pavement, they call them hockey pucks, sensors embedded in the concrete or asphalt. There's also Bluetooth sensors, which will measure O&D, your origin and destination, are now revealed because you left your Bluetooth device on, maybe inadvertently. There are also overhead microwave DOT, Illinois DOT, Iowa DOT, for example, I know have these overhead and microwave sensors. Cell phone will give away your location just by the GPS location chip in there, and they can also find your phone by triangulating off the location of the signal. So there's actually 2, 3, or 4 ways. If you look at Wi-Fi on your phone, Bluetooth on your phone, triangulating on your phone, and the GPS chips are 4 ways your phone is giving away your location currently. And then beyond that, there are also citizen tweets. I'll take a little bit of credit perhaps. Here in Colorado, we did a test project with Waze last summer. We had a major bicycle race here in Colorado, and we were able to, for the first time ever, work with the Waze technology people and have them proactively put in not a cone zone for tomorrow, but it was a bike race. So we had a massive street block-off plan, and Waze was able to proactively load all the street closures in advance so that at 9:01 a.m. when the race began, everything changed instantly for anybody traveling around using the Waze or Google system. So we thought that was pretty cool that proactively reporting cone zones is just now getting underway, thanks in large part to some of the work we've done here. And also just want to point out that, that as we talk about driverless cars in the future, we'll talk in a few slides about that, keep in mind that what really is crucial is friction sensors, which we haven't yet developed, and they really aren't perfected yet in terms of technology maturation. We quite aren't there yet in terms of being able to measure, and I'll talk here in a minute about the reason why pavement friction sensors are so critical. So with that, let me talk about, okay, driverless cars, and okay, so what's the big deal? You know, with all this, oh gosh, yeah, Uber's got a driverless car, that's cute. Aren't those sweet, running around all by their own? Well, that's not the point of it. What I find just to be a profound change is that to think about mass transit for a second. How many people across the country take mass transit on a day-to-day basis? Yes, many do. If you live in downtown or work in downtown Chicago, you're looking at maybe, would you believe, 5% in a major urbanized area take mass transit. What else are people using now differently? So transit is one of them. Carpooling, yeah, maybe you get 5% of ADT, average daily traffic, or volume reduction by carpooling. Telecommuting has actually been pretty effective, relatively. I mean, people, you know, I work actually from home on occasion, and maybe it's a Monday here and a Friday there, but telecommuting has resulted in about a 10 to 20% reduction in total volume. So you take telecommuting, carpooling, and transit, you get 5, and 10 maybe. Driverless capacity, the increase in the volume that our infrastructure will be able to handle mathematically, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, is about 300%. So imagine all of transit, and we were spending billions on transit as a nation, carpooling, telecommuting, combined, maybe you get 20 to 30% reduction. We're talking 10 times that in terms of capacity increases, theoretically, by using these new technologies. And that's one of the profound changes that we see. I think what's scary is that by 2025, many people are saying is that 10% of our cars will be not autonomous, driverless by 2025. So 7 years from now. But by 2040, and if anybody's a fan of, say, the sitcom Seinfeld, think back, Seinfeld came out just about 23 years ago. Well, fast forward 23 years into the future, which is not that far in the future. It's as far in the future as Seinfeld was in the past. 80% of our cars supposedly will be driverless. And if that's true, what about our 2040 transportation plan? What if you don't need the volume? What if you don't need to widen the roads? What if the entire modality of our network it really will change? You know, when you look back, when Henry Ford invented his little Model T, 1903 was part of that. 12 years later, we had a complete shift in modality across the nation. It took 12 years to go from the horse and buggy to the horseless carriage. That took 12 years. We're talking here 23 years to make the next major change in modality. I think it's going to happen. Interestingly, about 94% of our councils of government, or MPOs, are ignoring this fact. So the 2040 plans on the books right now don't even talk about any of these changes in technology. So hold that thought for a minute till the next slide here. So talking about, you know, there is a difference, by the way, between autonomous actually, if you have which I do, I've got a 3-year-old Jeep Grand Cherokee. It's got a semi-autonomous function. I can push a button on it, and it keeps me from hitting the idiot in front of me. If he brakes or she brakes without any warning, it'll stop my car, and it'll keep varying the speed that my Jeep Grand Cherokee drives at. That's autonomous or semi-autonomous. But driverless or self-driving is where you have no steering wheel in the car. And the only way that we think, and many of these futurists are talking about these technologies working and getting the 300% increase in capacity, will be going to what they call now a totally managed system. A totally managed system is where you may not need traffic signals, but you need an awful lot of technology. You have vehicle to vehicle, they call it V2V, and you need V2I, vehicle to infrastructure, connections between the cars and the infrastructure to make all this stuff work. So maybe traffic signals go away, the cars talk to the infrastructure, V2I, cars talk to vehicles, that's vehicle to vehicle. And in a system like that, which may be sooner than we think coming up, we may see these profound changes in our transportation networks. So speaking of profound changes, so there are a lot of future predictions out there. If you've seen these hurricane prediction charts that they use now, these spaghetti maps, as they're called, where you have all these predictions about where the hurricane's going to go up. Is it going over Bermuda? Is it going over Florida? Well, this is the same kind of a spaghetti chart, so to speak. And what I find interesting here is that actually 2040 is kind of the median year that many of these predictions about driverless and autonomous vehicle predictions are supposed. That's kind of the median hit point, which again comes back to everybody's talking about the 2040 target zone for all these autonomous, all these smart technologies really converging and really being deployed or executed across all of our infrastructure. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ed Barrett. Ed has a phenomenal background in a lot of these telecommunications and technologies, and I'll shut up for a while, and Ed, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dave. So as Dave has talked about, there are obviously a number of sort of societal shifts that are occurring currently. There are also technology changes that are going to rapidly affect cities and villages. Another key trend that we believe that will affect many of our clients is the densification of fiber that is going to accompany 5G deployment. Today in the world, most people, when you talk about a cell tower, think about the picture at left. It's a fairly high tower that's been erected. It serves about a 3-mile round area that it provides service. It's connected with fiber back to the telecommunications system. Your cell phone talks to the tower. Most of the data that is created is subsequently carried by fiber back to the internet and back to switches and electronic devices. The picture at right is an example of what you will see coming as cellular moves into a 5G world. The transmitter will be much smaller. It will be mounted on top of streetlights, on the sides of buildings, and because of the technology change and the wavelength that's being used for these transmitters, you will see them being propagated about every 200 to 300 feet. So instead of 3 miles, you will now see a fiber-fed infrastructure that is going to be much more robust. Those signals do not carry as far, but they will be very, very fast. And the cellular carriers are already planning for, and in one case, Verizon Wireless is already beginning to construct a massive fiber deployment. In Illinois, these issues, the carriers have begun a very active legislating initiative, and that has resulted, I know, at least in Illinois, in Texas, and 2 or 3 other states, in the passing of sort of static standard language that will enable those carriers, in many cases, to preempt local control of infrastructure that has been in place for a long time. In Illinois, SB 1451 was recently signed by the governor, and that prohibits from municipalities from charging more than, I believe, $250 per permit location. It limits their ability to create aesthetic conditions for deployments, and really does hamper the local control of these assets, which we believe is very important. If you are an Illinois city or village, you may have already been affected. If you are not in Illinois, we would strongly encourage you as a city to get ahead of this trend, because they are pushing this on a national basis, because they understand just how important this is to create this robust network. More broadly, smart cities and these trends really create a world where you need to interconnect everything. Technology is certainly going to be a driver, and fiber is really going to be the critical platform on which many of these technologies will run. Data has to be exchanged quickly, it has to be exchanged accurately, and it has to be super fast. And fiber ultimately creates the best conditions for those transfers. So looking at how we believe communities will set path forwards, we really want to make sure that you're not only sort of understanding the issues that are out there, but how to react to those trends and get your community moving forward. So one of the key barriers facing many communities is it really can be a lack of, in some cases, interdepartmental thinking. The water department system controls their meter reading system, and that work is planned in isolation. You may have a fantastic adaptive traffic signal management system, but that maybe doesn't coordinate with public safety and police response needs. So if you will agree that interconnecting everything and big data is crucial, then the first step really has to be creating active synergies, not only within departments as they look at solving these problems, but across those departmental lines. So one thing that we believe is important that communities begin to do today is to think about establishing fiber optic infrastructure. It could be owned by the community, it could be deployed through a private provider, but we believe that enabling the technology to begin connecting these pieces becomes a real crucial first step for many of our clients. Nearly everything that you'll do, not only with smart cities, will require capacity in this area, but things that will help you prepare for that smarter future. Design and deployment can be costly, but there are things that you can do as a community to enable the development of fiber assets and fiber infrastructure in a way that is not as costly, that creates incremental steps forward for your community. So short term, we would recommend really 3 steps. First, we believe that the establishment of a vision for your community in this area is crucial. All too often, we see smart city programs that can be driven by public works, the economic development, the IT department, and really miss the benefits of a more holistic cross-departmental approach to planning. Second, we believe that you need to really actively devote time to understanding the assets that you have today. Most communities have some deployed infrastructure, and in many cases have underutilized capacity in their systems. You need to look for that. You need to understand where are your conduits, where are your fiber strands, what abandoned infrastructure is out there. How can you identify areas where you have that underutilized capacity to most effectively leverage it? And finally, we would really encourage you, again, at a very low-cost entry point, to develop pro-fiber policies. Most of these are not only no cost, but can actually create revenue by transferring dollars from cost causers back to the city's coffers through programs like street cut fees, pavement degradation fees, and other sorts of ordinances and policies. The city of Centennial in Colorado took just such an approach. They leveraged pro-fiber policies to create millions of dollars in infrastructure, really virtually at pennies on the dollar. We are lucky enough here at HR Green to have Dave Zelenak, who helped to lead Centennial on this path. And Dave, would you mind sharing a few of your experiences at the helm of that Centennial effort?
Be happy to, Ed. In fact, as Ed said, probably the most important thing here for cities and towns and villages is to understand that it doesn't take a fortune. You don't have to break the piggy bank to put this fiber optic infrastructure in place. One example that I'll touch on that Ed talked about, abandoned infrastructure. There are a lot of cities. In fact, we're working with one right now that's using a 3,000-foot length of an abandoned water pipe. They don't need the water pipe anymore. It's corroded. They're putting a brand new one parallel to it. And so we will repurpose that water pipe into a fiber optic conduit, huge fiber optic conduit. But that's just one example. I worked with the city of Centennial, as I said earlier. We worked with the city council there, and the mayor engaged a number of pro-fiber policies. And I wish we had time to go through them today, but the essence of them really is that every time someone would come to say, hey, I'd like to dig a hole in your street, and I want to put in some fiber optic line, or I want to put in an electrical conductor, or I'm digging a new pipe over here. They were required in Centennial to come to the city government. You pull a permit, as you do in most cities, and then the one thing different is I've had one of our engineers pull the permit and look at it for a co-location opportunity. And so here's an example. Here's a boring machine. You probably see these all over town these days, but for a boring installer to put in a conduit, that's the plastic pipe Amazing, the plastic pipe itself only costs about $1 a foot to buy, but it's such a pain in the you-know-what to put in. Per linear foot, that first pipe going in the ground costs about $20. And so if you're a private provider and you've got in order to put in 1,000 feet of conduit for a major customer, per foot, $20 is about what you'll pay. What we did in Centennial, it's not rocket science, and you don't need us for a lot of this, frankly, is to have a series of these pro-fiber policies to where we would require them to come in and we would pay the full upcharge, so about $2 per foot for every additional co-located fiber. And so here's a map of Centennial. Centennial is about 15 miles east-west. The little bragging rights, Centennial loves to say that they are the largest city ever founded in the nation's history. And a little bit of history lesson here. The city is only 15 years old. They run much of it by contract, which we call alternate service delivery. And every one of the green dots there is a traffic signal. Green and red dots are traffic signals across Centennial. In 2011, I believe it was, we did the first intergovernmental agreement and public-private partnership to install some fiber under one of the major arterials in Centennial. It was a 24-strand of state DOT fiber. We pulled that out. We pulled through two 96-strand cables. By the way, 96-strand cable these days only goes for about $1 a foot. So it's not a lot of money in this thing. And this was what we started off with. Let me fast forward. Is it a better one or is it better two, as they say in the eye doctor? This is 4 years later, over a 4-year period. My people installed just about 60 miles of this stuff. Here's the amazing part. We spent about $600,000 putting 60 miles of infrastructure in, it's called the Denver Tech Center area. So it's high-rise office buildings, it's neighborhood streets, it's major arterials, it's heavily congested. We spent $600,000 of public funds, half of which, by the way, were DOT and other federal and state grants. So the city only paid $300,000 of city money. This is over a 4-year period, so that's less than $1 per person per year to put it into population per capita. So per person, per resident, less than $1 per person per year, got us a 60-mile. In fact, this is an old slide, shows $6 million value. The latest number I've heard is between 10 and 20 million. So we put in $300,000 of city money, and now they have an asset worth at least 6, maybe 10, maybe approaching $20 million because the stuff is so valuable, because, as Ed said just a minute ago, because of this densification, that these major providers are going crazy looking for fiber optic strands all over the place. They know what's coming. This 5G network is on the books like a freight train heading our way, and they can't get enough of this quickly enough, and they're looking for every available inch of it out there. So it's a great time if you're in a city, town, or village. It's a great time to change, to embrace some of these pro-fiber policies, to spend a few bucks and really create value and really leveraging. We found that it's really literally pennies on the dollar is all it takes, and we're happy to help advise interested people with this. So Ed, back to you.
Great, thanks, Dave. So if the first step down this path is the leveraging of policy to improve the condition of your community, the next step is really the next step forward is creation of really what we refer to as community fiber networks, and this is, really reflects the fact that many communities eventually determine that they need to own and manage their own infrastructure to advance their vision and their strategy. Most communities already have existing public fiber that they're using for, SCADA or intelligent transportation systems or AMI and automated meter reading, streetlight controls. And as we saw in Centennial, the ability to leverage not only those assets, but create new partnerships and funding streams really becomes crucial to building at the lowest possible cost. So as you begin to think about this holistically, there are opportunities to create partnerships, to leverage federal and local grant programs to help you pay for much of the base cost of the primary purpose of your initial fiber build. As you do that, the secret sauce tends to be that excess capacity can be piggybacked onto these projects. You can then use that excess capacity across a variety of municipal needs and there are significant dollars available to help you and your anchor institutions improve this communication infrastructure. A quick case study I'd like to share with you a recent example, and that is a large suburban water meter system. The city was looking at replacing their old wireless AMR that was sort of approaching the end of its useful life. The cost of a pure replacement would have been, about $1.7 million up front. But with a 3-year useful life, you triple that cost over the next 20 years to really something that's probably much closer to $6 million. So in that scenario is a smarter approach to consider deployment of fiber. Instead of using wireless infrastructure that has to be replaced frequently and is sort of single purpose, the community is really having an ongoing discussion about, should we, instead of replacing in kind with this single purpose wireless infrastructure, should we be looking at a fiber-based solution that not only solves this one department's issue, but also brings with it the opportunity to solve a broader community challenge and create capacity for the future. So as you begin to think about those interconnection points, and you begin to think about the long term, one of the biggest challenges of creating, and we tend not to love the word smart city, but let's say smarter communities, is really the interconnected nature of these issues and solutions. As David talked about earlier, solving the driverless car issue isn't just a project. As technologies emerge to address a solution to enable driverless vehicles, those consequences really begin to spiderweb into issues of parking and speed enforcement. Do you need traffic cops? The answer may be no. Do you have, you have myriad other impacts. And one of the things that we believe is that it's crucial for communities to really begin to think about cumulative impact, because understanding that becomes frustrating as the X on the map really appears to continuously move from spot to spot. So the solution to these issues really requires a commitment to not just deploy a single project and declare victory, but to maintain sort of a continuous loop so that you're monitoring the impacts of the projects that you're completing, you're assessing those consequences, and really trying to stay ahead and ensure that the cumulative impacts of those decisions are moving the community forward and aligning it with your vision. In many cases, really this means then, as Dave indicated earlier, that you have to really take steps to understand data differently than we do today. So once upon a time, the collection of data was really the challenge point. Communities were challenged to understand, how do I get the data that I need? I would argue that our new reality is not being challenged by getting the data, but the ability to assess and understand what messages it's sending and to communicate those messages back to stakeholders. So communities are tending to turn more and more to customizable dashboards. Importing and managing that data so people get the information they need becomes crucial. Whether you are a first responder who needs to know location and cause and visual conditions at an accident site, or a transit department that needs to understand where buses are and whether they're on time on a given route. So, marketers have long used big data to deliver what's known as mass customization. And this means that really you're giving everyone the data that they need that is most useful to them. It's not automated, but it gives you the ability to serve up this data in a way that people really want and need to consume it. Some communities choose to then take a next step forward and actively begin to think not only about how can we leverage fiber for data and smart community and internal use, but how can we provide services to anchor institutions or even residential and business customers. Here in Illinois, in Champaign-Urbana, the communities in partnership with the university leveraged some federal funding, a number of federal funding and some partner funding and some state matching dollars to create a network that serves today 250 anchor institutions, and then found a private partner that they worked with to build last mile connections to residents and businesses. Some communities may make the decision that because of their desire to address things like education, things like the digital divide, that community broadband becomes the next logical extension of their fiber networks. So interestingly, we talked a little bit about Centennial. If you look at the end game here in the town of Centennial, you know, this path isn't always a direct forward path. Centennial is a great case study because they really sort of followed this roadmap a step at a time. They began by creating public policy that enabled them to create assets and value. In many cases, as Dave has indicated, at pennies on the dollar. They leveraged those assets to create a community fiber network that really served its traffic and ITS needs, and then identified a broadband partner in Ting Internet that is now bringing gigabit service to deliver on broadband capability to residents and businesses. Some communities beyond broadband are looking at some creative solutions. You know, you could argue that it's just a street light, but some communities are choosing to extend their reach by, you know, municipalizing or enhancing street lights to become smart lights. In the first case, municipalization of street lights can reduce not only, you know, reduce carbon footprints by moving to LED lighting, but can also reduce costs pretty significantly. In some cases, from as much as $20 a month to an electric utility to as little instead as $2 a month. So moving to LED can drop that to a single dollar. So cities who municipalize are frequently seeing 5 or 10-year ROIs on those investments. But beyond the use of the light for lighting, there are also myriad uses for poles that are positioned across the community. You'll recall the image of the 5G transmitter. In many communities, they're looking at deploying those small cells to streetlights. Poles can be wired to provide an integrated system and help you control aesthetics. But beyond that, these lights can become, once they're connected, very smart and very integral in establishing and maintaining things like district visibility. You can direct vehicles to open parking ramps. You can promote upcoming community events with programmable and digital signage, and they can be a great platform and are being used across the country as deployment sources for sensors and counters. So understanding and helping the community understand pedestrian traffic and weather status and public safety uses. So all of these controlled digitally, integrated into their community's dashboards.
And if I can just add in there, just to amplify on what Ed said, that really is the driver behind why so many cities are municipalizing their street lighting. You know, under federal law, if a city wants to buy, in fact, there's one city we're working with here in Colorado that is using eminent domain. I'm not always suggesting that, but they're using eminent domain. They want them so badly. They're condemning the street lights. Interestingly, the street lights, as Ed said, have an incredible value as a future transmitter or future use for any number of purposes. But interestingly, the conduit value, the value of the conduit feeding the street light for its electrical conductor may even be more valuable than the street light itself. If you look at those companies doing the fiber densification, need conduit is probably the #1 critical thing that they're looking for. And so suddenly you turn a liability, as Ed said, $20 per street light per month. It's not unusual for a city, town, or village to pay to their power company $20. You buy them out, you eliminate that cost. Yes, you've got to maintain them, but now you've turned a liability into a revenue source, and that's the power of so much of the smart city initiatives that we go through. So just to highlight that, it's a big deal, Ed. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to steal your thunder, Ed. But
no, thank you, Dave. So across all of these alternatives, and certainly one of the challenges with smart city is that it has as many definitions as you'd like to talk to people who care to talk about smart cities. So we like to really narrow things and say, you know, so what can you do right now? What are 5 things that you can do? And I think where we've seen communities successfully move forward, number one, they've identified an internal champion, and I can't stress how important it is that there is somebody inside of the government, your local government, who really believes strongly that this is important stuff. If you don't have that, it will be a project that gets done and studied and put on a shelf, or it will die a quick and slow death with you know, being sniped at from the side. Assessing infrastructure, again, it can't stress how important it is for you as a community to understand not only what you have, but what your vision is for how you're going to complete that. A close friend of mine frequently says, everybody will agree in a community, broadband good, but once you leave that very well-defined starting gate, the number of paths that you can follow to get to the end becomes almost infinite. So understanding where you want to go, understanding and creating that vision and direction becomes such an important first step for most of our communities that we work with. We think it's also almost silly not to be thinking about how to change policies to become more fiber friendly.
Those are free.
Yeah, these are free. They're low or no cost. They require minimal energy and effort, and if done right, can really help position your community 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road to be in a very, very enviable position.
You know, just one quick story, real life. One city that we've worked with here has gotten over $1 million annually in new revenues from simply doing these, not only no cost, but they can be revenue generating initiatives. And I wish we had time to go into that today, but there's $1 million of real cash coming into the city by embracing these fiber friendly policies and really looking hard at what's going on in your city in terms of infrastructure. And beyond that, beyond the $1 million of cash coming in, they've also increased the requirements for the number 2 point here that Ed made, is assessing your infrastructure. Not only do they get cash coming in, but they get detailed maps down to within an inch or two of where every underground pipe goes in by a private installer. So you can improve your GIS accuracy, you can improve the number of layers and the amount of attributes that are in there, and you can make some money at this for your city all at the same time. So almost sounds too good to be true, Ed.
Well, and lastly, we certainly encourage communities identify a trusted advisor. We would love to think that HR Green is in a unique position because we work both as a fiber and a broadband services organization, but also because we're, as Chris mentioned, a 105-year-old company that really cut our teeth and continue to do things primarily in the public space. We are city engineers, we are public works directors, we are people who understand the ins and outs of community government, and we would hope that at some point we may be able to help you if you decide to take this journey, that perhaps we can be of assistance. With that, Chris, I will throw it back to you, and if there are any questions we can answer, Dave and I would be happy to do so with the remaining time.
Great, thanks, guys. At this time, we're going to field some of the questions that I got from the audience. We will make sure that we wrap up before the top of the hour, and then afterwards, we are going to put a recording of this on our website, and all participants of the webinar will get a follow-up email with a link to that video as well as our contact information. So the first question I have here is, how would you suggest we develop our vision?
Ed, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Chris, I think one of the things that we traditionally will start with is, in many communities, we have seen in some cases that there have been some challenges and maybe even disconnects when city staff are asked to do this work in a vacuum. So the engagement of councils and elected officials becomes very, very important. The collection and participation of the public through public process, public meetings, town halls, really becomes very crucial to help communities understand where their citizens are relative to both their satisfaction with and their ability to pay for the services that they need. And we really would encourage many of the communities, we do encourage many of the communities that we work with to start with, active engagement, multi-function groups within the city government, the ability to pull IT,
utilities,
public works, utilities, all of the departments together, because in many cases those conversations just aren't happening. But then to vet that information that is bubbled up against public and elected officials, and also public outreach and public conversation.
Good answer.
Great, thanks. The next question is there funding available to assist us?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, so most state DOTs have money, for example, for improving traffic signal coordination. That's a big deal, and I can tell you that in Colorado Springs, we built over 300 miles of fiber optic cable, largely with, it starts out to be federal DOT grants. The state DOT, I'll call it launders it, and they do a little skimming off the top. But I've spent millions of DOT dollars installing fiber optic cables between and among traffic signals. Likewise, utilities, there's a lot of money out there for those. If you're in a more rural area, there's plenty of money out there for education and even healthcare. All these do have some strings attached, but when you look at it, usually they're 50-50, 75-25, 80-20. There's always a match required. But you can really leverage a lot of these funding sources out there and do some incredible things with them.
Chris, one other thing that is coming down the pike right now is the federal government Department of Transportation had a Tiger Grant program that was available. That has been replaced by a Build Grant program that focuses 30% of the dollars that are being deployed, and I think that amounts to about $1.5 billion in infrastructure grants that are due by the end of July. Those have a very strong component of those relative to fiber that can be used to improve rural broadband. So part of that funding program, there is an intersect and again strengthening that connection of transportation dollars being used to help facilitate the development of fiber infrastructure that can be used to support broadband, particularly in rural areas of the country right now.
Okay, and then we had one final question, and that's, if we use grant dollars to build our infrastructure, are there any restrictions?
It really depends on the source of the grant, Chris. In the case, for example, of the traffic signal dollars that come from the DOTs, you have to be careful. You have to do some careful accounting so you can, first and foremost, assure the public grant funder, the benefactor, the source of the funds, that you have met the intent of the grant. So if the DOT gives you $1 million to interconnect 14 traffic signals, that you have to be able to, of course, prove that you have fulfilled that grant requirement. By the way, if there's excess capacity, and that's the beauty of this fiber optic stuff. 15 years ago, when I had my folks wire up the first traffic signals using fiber optic strands, we could maybe get a dozen traffic signals on a single strand of fiber optic cable. Today, that same strand, there's one city, Longmont, Colorado, is amazingly, they're powering 5,000, not traffic signals, 5,000 households at gigabit speed through a single strand of fiber. 15 years ago, we could get a dozen traffic signals. Now we're talking 5,000 households at gigabit speed through the strand. And so you can install fiber and then simply use that excess capacity. If you're careful, you do your bookkeeping accurately, close out the grant, you can use the excess capacity for other purposes. You just have to know the ins and outs of that. Again, we can help you with that, but that's what we're good at. So that's why you don't need to develop this necessarily in-house. So, Chris, I hope any other questions? I think we're actually running ahead of schedule. So yeah.
Yeah, we actually just got one more question, and I'll read it. It says, many communities in Iowa that are rolling out fiber to the home projects are communities that have an existing electric utility. This can provide the operational infrastructure and potential funding source to implement and get a telecom project operational. What do you suggest for communities that do not have an electric utility and are starting up a telecom to get funding? Revenue bonds mixed with other financing?
Wow, that's a very good question, and I will say, from our experience, that having a strong and sort of well-respected electric utility, it certainly is an accelerator for communities that are really thinking about going to the extent of deploying, not just fiber infrastructure, but also broader broadband services for their community. Having said that, I do think that there are paths forward for communities that don't have that advantage.
Well, Centennial is a good example. The Centennial has no utilities at all. Some of the less difficult ones are the communities that have a water department. So they have billing, they roll trucks, they have customer service desks already. So you need not have an electrical power, and that was the Longmont example that I just made. They have electric power there, but if you have a water utility, you're half the way there already. Or in Centennial's case, as we saw, you may not want to be the provider of that internet service. So it may not be municipal fiber, but there are public-private partnerships, P3s as they're often called. And the one Ed mentioned earlier is Ting, is going into Centennial very successfully. And Centennial has no utilities at all. Again, they probably couldn't do that if not for the backbone, and the backbone didn't happen overnight. It started, as you heard us say, with public policy changes. It went through 4 years of heavy co-location and permitting executions, and now 4 years later, they've got Ting doing it. Actually, it's a revenue generator for the town that put in, as you saw earlier, a few $100,000 can actually attract a large international provider.
Yeah, and from a funding perspective, again, that ability to create the vision becomes the first step. Funding is maybe a little easier for a significant community broadband project. The ability to leverage revenue bonds from the electric utility certainly is a path forward. We've seen communities that however, will choose to obligate GO bonds, and those bonds, depending on the tax authority and the bonding cap available within a community can be used. Many communities, again, will choose to look for private partners. That's their vision. But there are a number of things that are available out there, including, the leveraging, as we mentioned in a slide earlier, of E-rate, school funds, rural health funding, USAC dollars for rural communities. So it's a complex funding structure, and many communities that may not have the ability to go out directly to a revenue bond through an electric utility will find that they need to, for lack of a better word, cobble together a number of funding sources to help make these projects financially and long-term sustainable and feasible.
Yeah, the Centennial one, as I mentioned earlier, was less than $1 per resident, $1 per capita per year, got them almost a $20 million asset. So it doesn't take a lot of money if you're smart about leveraging this stuff. So anyway, well, that's all I've got. Any other questions, Chris? I think we're running a little ahead of schedule. We got a little change in our pocket. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was the last one. Thanks everybody. Thank you for the audience for joining us today. And again, thank you, Ed and Dave, for the great presentations and discussions. You will all receive a follow-up email from us shortly with a link to the video and our contact information. And again, thank you and have a wonderful day.